Now, at the moment, this application has some minor problems. Most importantly, if I select a month here, we don't get any feedback initially until the data is loaded, which takes a while, and we got no feedback whilst we're waiting for the data. And that might be strange. Why are we getting no loading feedback when loading a month, even though we of course have a parent loading.js file? Well, we're not getting any feedback because when selecting a month, we already are on that filter page here, and therefore Next.js does not swap it for the loading fallback, since we already have some data here. We're just loading some new data, but we already did load data before, so it's not showing us that loading fallback again. Now we can work around that by using a more granular approach of showing a loading fallback, an alternative to using the loading.js file, which you, by the way, can always use as an alternative, not just in situations like this. And that alternative uses the Suspense component that is provided by React to tell Next.js in detail for which kind of data we want to wait and under which circumstances a loading fallback should be shown. Now, how can we use Suspense for that? Well, as a first step, we have to create a separate component. And we can do that in a separate file or in the same file as this page component. And here I'll just use that same file to keep those things together. Now you can give this component any name of your choice. I'll name it filtered news. Now here in this component, I'll of course get a props object, and I expect up to 2 props to be passed to this component. The selected year, or maybe just year to keep it a bit shorter, and the selected month, though both might be undefined. And then in the end, I want to move that code where I get the news for the year out of the filtered news page into the filtered news component. And therefore this should become an async component, which it can because all components, not just page components, are server components by default in Next.js. So I'll create that news variable, and then I check if we have a year and we don't have a month, and in that case I'll set my news to the news for a selected year, though it's no longer called selected year here, but instead just year. Else if we have a year and a month, so if we have both, news should be set equal to get news for year and month, and I pass both the year and the month to that function. So now with that, I'm fetching my news like this, and then I want to output that news list just as I did it before. So I'll actually grab this code, where I also render some fallback in case we don't have any news, and I'll cut this and add this here. And then I can just return that news content here, like this. Now we should clean up the filtered news page, and there I still want to extract the selected year and selected month, but we no longer need the news variable here. And we also won't populate it here, therefore. And I'll actually also improve this code a little bit and not fetch the same information twice, but instead I'll just fetch my available years here and then use that fetched value as a default value for my links, like this. And I now don't want to output the news content here, but instead this newly added filtered news component, to which we pass a year prop, which is set equal to selected year, and a month prop, which is set equal to selected month. Now, with that alone, nothing would change. If I now reload this page, we're still loading the data for a selected year, and I can load the data for a selected month, but I still get no loading fallback. But now that we outsourced this data fetching logic where we fetch the news for a year or month into a separate React server component, we can use that React suspense hook I mentioned before. So for that, we now wrap suspense around the component that does the data fetching for which we want to provide our own custom loading fallback. And suspense must be imported from React, so you must import this component. And with it being wrapped around a component that fetches data, it will automatically register if that component is still fetching data, and it allows us to show a fallback whilst that's the case. So here I can then say loading news or something like this. And with that, we then have a very granular way of telling Next.js that a part of the JSX code should be replaced with a fallback if that part is fetching data. With loading.js, it's less granular. There, we're telling Next.js that an entire component, the entire page component actually, should be replaced with that fallback if it's fetching data. But if we're then just refetching data, it will not be replaced again. And if we wanted to be more granular in general, we couldn't do it with a loading.js file. But we can be very granular by defining our own suspense boundaries. And therefore, with this added now, if I now reload, we got the same effect as before. But now you already see we got the loading news fallback here. And if I now click on a month, we also see loading news here until the month appears. Though, as you can see, it actually still takes a short while until we see that fallback after I clicked on a month. And that's happening because technically Next.js is re-rendering this page when we click on a month because we did change the route parameters, and therefore it does refetch the data for the header that's shown above the news list. And hence it, for example, again gets the available news years. And therefore we might want to wrap this header with a suspense boundary as well, so that we actually add another component. And again, we could outsource them into separate files, but since they do belong directly to this page, I'll keep them in the same file here for now. And I'll name this component filter or filter header, whatever. And this should also become an async component because it also is a React server component. And now we can grab this code here where we set up the links and cut that from the filtered news page and instead add it here to the filter header and expect to get the year and month that was selected through the route parameters here as well, and then use month instead of selected month and year instead of selected year, like this. And then, of course, also output that header. So here I'll grab that header JSX code and cut it, and then go back here to my filter header and return it here, like this. And now we can use the filter header in the filtered news page, like this, and of course also pass year and month to that. And again, we can now wrap this with suspense and say loading filter, but now we'll show different loading fallbacks for these different areas. And if they take different amounts of times to load, we'll show content as soon as it's ready because these two suspense boundaries do not wait on each other. Instead, each boundary will show its data once it's there and show its fallback until it's there, but it does not wait for any other data in any other suspense wrapped component to load. That's really great, and that gives you a really granular way of showing a fallback and handling the loading state of data in your page components. Now, of course, here in my code, I actually still need to know about those available years to potentially show an error if we have an invalid filter, but actually we can move that code into the filter header as well. So therefore, I'll go to the filter header here and add this if check, where I check if we have a year and the available years do not include that year, or if we have a month and the available months for a year do not include that month. And in that case, I still throw an error and it will bubble up to the closest error handling component, so to the closest error.js file. And therefore now if we save that and reload, you see we got two different loading fallbacks here. And it looks like I forgot to rename one selected year occurrence. Yep, that should be year, not selected year. But with that, if we save that and we reload, we got these two different loading states, and then we got our data. And now if I click on that filter, again, you see loading filter, loading use, and we therefore give the user a better feedback regarding what's happening behind the scenes. And of course, you can be as granular as you want to. You could use one suspense boundary for both components. So that would also work if you wanted to do that. This is all up to you, as you see here. But that's the great thing about React and Next.js. You get a lot of tools and a lot of flexibility, and now you also know how to use these tools.